All right, we're going to get started here. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Board Leadership Calgary 2020. This is the last of our series here. So if many of you have attended our previous two in the past month, welcome to our third one here. My name is Justin Solomilo. I'm from Alberta Community Development Unit. I'm one of the members of the planning committee with Board Leadership Calgary. I'm also joined by my co-host, Aaron McFarland from CommunityWise Resource Centre, and my colleague, Phil, who's currently not on video, but he'll be supporting some of our tech today. So if you have any challenges, feel free to direct message him. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge that we are on traditional territories in Alberta of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. Today, I am joining you from Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, as well as the Iskia, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We would love to know where you are all joining us today. So I'll get Phil to put up a poll and just click where you're joining us, and your options are going to be if you're in the Calgary area, somewhere in Alberta, or potentially outside of Alberta. Just a quick check to see where everyone's from. If you don't have access to the poll function, just feel free to say hello in the chat from where you're joining us today. Ooh, a pretty good mix today, actually, from somewhere else in Alberta and the Calgary area. Welcome. So Board Leadership Calgary is a learning collaborative that was formed in 2013 to organize affordable and accessible learning opportunities for board members and staff of smaller not-for-profits. So we're very excited that you joined us this year. If you've been to a past event, you know that we are doing things a little bit different in 2020. And we hope to offer a number of great workshops as we did in the past month or so and today. So staff and volunteers from a variety of organizations work together to plan this event. And this includes Alberta Culture, Multiculturalism and Status of Women, CommunityWise Resource Centre, the Federation of Calgary Communities, the Rose Foundation, Sparrow Consulting, and other nonprofit leaders. We'd also like to say a very special thank you to our sponsors that support our efforts to keep this learning event affordable, Service Credit Union and Simple Cloudworks. And we also want to thank the Friends of Federation of Calgary Communities as our fiscal supporter, and the Rose Foundation for supporting our webinar Zoom functionality today. And then I will give it to you, Erin.
Thank you, Justin. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Before we get started, we just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. So hopefully at this point, your audio level is okay. And if not, please let us know in the chat. You all may also want to check your own audio settings as well. If you have any trouble with your connection, we also have a dial-in option, and we're going to post the information about that in the chat. If you have questions or thoughts throughout the presentation today, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we're going to try our best to get to as many as we can within the time frame that we have today. If you don't have the Q&A functionality, you can also use the chat box also at the bottom of your screen. We are recording today's session, and we'll try to make the recording available as soon as possible after the presentation. You'll receive a link to it in your email, and we'll also post it on our website. At the end of the presentation, there's going to be a window pop up that will have the link to our evaluation in it. Please fill it out. It's a really helpful way for us to receive feedback that helps us plan for the future. And it also helps our sponsors know that this is an event that's worth funding. Some of you have already registered for our follow-up Friday event, which is happening next Friday, December 11th. And this is an extended question and answer period for questions people may have had during today's webinar that weren't answered today. This is an optional event, and so you can visit our Eventbrite page to register if you haven't yet. And I think that's all I have for that slide. So I'm excited to welcome our presenters today. We have jaqs from For Equity and Thulasy from CommunityWise, and they've indicated that they would like to introduce themselves in more detail. And so I'm going to just turn it over to the two of you. So welcome to both of you today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you and welcome to this session. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday morning. My name is Thulasy. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the equity coordinator at CommunityWise Resource Centre. And I'm going to say a little bit more about CommunityWise in just a bit. Yeah, maybe jaqs, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Thulasy. Thanks, Board Leadership Calgary, for having us. My name is jaqs, aquines. She, her, they, them pronouns. I am a AROC advisory group member. I've been a consultant and facilitator in anti-racism for a couple of years now, and a community organizer, specifically with the Filipinx community here in Calgary, a co-founder of Bahaghari, grassroots two-spirit LGBTQIA+ group, and also a videographer and photographer. And I have a book coming out this month called Home is in the Body. If you want to pre-order, it's at homeisinthebody.ca. And apparently Rupi Kaur just came out with a book called Home Body, so with the same like font and color scheme on her cover. That's cool.
Thanks so much, jaqs. Maybe if you want to put up the slide deck, I can say a little bit about CommunityWise and where the content that we'll be sharing today, where it kind of comes from. CommunityWise Resource Centre is a nonprofit resource center located in the Beltline of Calgary, or Mohkinstsis, as it's known in the Blackfoot language, between sort of the Beltline Rec Centre and the Memorial Library. It was the original YWCA, built in 1910. And on the photo that you're going to see shortly, there's kind of the group of original board of directors on the far left. jaqs, if you wouldn't mind going to the second slide there. The original YWC board of directors. The photo in the middle was when the YW moved on to a new location and the city assumed ownership of the building. A group of grassroots groups started to use the building for their own work that often was working in service of very marginalized communities. In the 70s, the city wanted to tear down the building, but these groups came together, formed a tenants association, and asked the city to lease the building so that they can continue their very important work. And the city agreed. And thus CommunityWise was born. We've been working in that governance structure and way for the last, 41 years. We celebrated our 40th anniversary last year. The photo on the right is from a recent AGM, not this year, of course. We weren't able to get together. I think it's from last year's AGM. We are home to over 80 nonprofits and grassroots groups that use the space for office space, meeting space. There's a dance studio and a kitchen. We offer backbone services like mail service and internet and programming that works in support of these members achieving their own goals. The work of these groups spans an incredible diversity of issue areas. There are ethnocultural groups, Indigenous-led groups, 2S LGBTQIA+ groups, addictions recovery groups, arts groups. It's really hard to actually categorize the level of diversity that we have in this building. And ever since that formation back in the 70s, it's been really important for the organization to honor the words diversity, inclusion, and equity. And they've been very important and central features to our organization, things that we really try to put in practice. In around 2015, however, we were paying closer attention to sort of the ways in which people were experiencing the building, and it came to our attention not through sort of an accusation or allegation of racism, but through evaluative effort, self-reflection activities, a research project where we were beginning to see an uneven experience for our Black, Indigenous, and racialized led member groups. And so we wanted to address this fully as a way of really honoring the goals that we had around being a diverse and inclusive space, a physical space for all these people. So we embarked on a journey called Anti-Racist Organizational Change, or AROC, which we will be referring to throughout this session. And at the time when we started this process, we didn't really know what it was going to look like. There wasn't a map or a sort of set of things, checklist ideas of how we were going to do this. So we walked forward as learners in this journey, really adhering to the principles of anti-racism and racial equity. And we're going to share what those words mean in this presentation, making sure that the process that we were undertaking was as equitable as the outcomes we were trying to achieve. We've been doing this work for almost 5 years now, and a lot of what we're going to be sharing in today's presentation is drawn from the lessons that we've learned in undertaking this work as an organization. And the tools and resources we've been able to develop or use and are sharing more broadly, and also some of the lessons we're learning in taking this out into the broader sector, training other nonprofits and talking to them about the work that they're doing. So that's where I'm coming from in this work and what we'd like to share with you today. Jax, is there anything that you'd like to add about that?
No, that's great. That was great. But I just do want to say that the 4 years that I've worked with the advisory group with AROC has shaped and informed much of the work that I do in every aspect of my life. So from community organizing to the projects that I do for art projects, or even the book that came out. It's shaped everything that I work on and in my interpersonal relationships. So this is a really valuable take. Anti-racism can change your life too. That's what I wanted to say. Thanks, Thulasy. Yeah, so now we're going to get into a settling exercise and technique. I hope that everybody's prepared because I mean, the title is Anti-Racism and Equity is for Everyone. And it is very difficult work though. So I want everybody to be mindful of what you experience when we go through this material, because much of it is going to be triggering or can cause a reaction in your body. So use your body as like a kind of like a tuning fork for the work. If it's challenging and you feel something, then you know you have to push through it. And this is how we're going to get grounded in this work. So if everybody could just, like, if you're seated or even standing, just get your feet grounded on the floor. I'm sitting here in my office space and I have my feet flat on the floor, and just straighten your back so that your spine is aligned, and align your seat bones like on your seat so that they're flat, and relax your shoulders. And now we're just going to take 4 deep breaths. So inhaling for 4 and then exhaling for 4. So inhale deep through your nose and exhale through your mouth. So inhaling 1, exhaling, and exhale it all out. 2, was that 4? So, and one more time, then we could do it. Close your eyes for this one. And if you could just inhale, smelling the roses on your own time, however long that takes, and exhale as slowly as possible, blowing out the candle. And let it all out. Now, relax your jaw. And this is a vocal technique that I used to do when I took like singing lessons, is throw your tongue on the floor, because we hold a lot of tension in our jaws. So just kind of make it like a yawn, and you'll do like this kind of sound. Mwah. Mwah. So just throw your tongue on the floor. It's really hard to do when you're laughing, but I'm going to do it on mute because it sounds really weird, but try it now. and the sound going down. I know it's so weird, but it actually is quite relaxing. And then if we could just take note of all the four corners of your room, this is to activate the vagus nerve. So look at the farthest left corner, and then the one at the front, and the front right corner, and the back right corner. And this is also just to relax your neck and just stretch it out as well. So these are areas of where you will hold a lot of tension in your shoulder and your neck and your jaw. And as we go through this, take note of what activates those feelings, and what it'll take to get through them is these breathing exercises as well. And I will also check in with your tuning fork throughout this session. Thanks.
All right, we just wanted to walk you through a couple of kind of grounding assumptions, or a way for us to just not just ground ourselves physically in this moment. Thank you so much, Jax, for taking us through that stuff, because it is so much in our bodies. But also so that we're all on the same page about what we're going to be working on today or talking about. So this is a grounding assumption from Dr. Beverly Tatum. She compares racism to smog. Sometimes it is so thick it is visible. Other times it is less apparent, but always day in and day out, we are breathing it in. I really like this metaphor and this visual, because sometimes when we get into spaces like this, there can be a desire, a reflex, a resistance to the content, a desire to sort of debate whether racism exists or not. But for us, as we go forward in the session, that's not what we're here for today. We're here to just assume that it is in the air that we are all breathing. As someone who is racialized and has experienced racism myself, I also am breathing this air in, and have obligations to be aware of that, and how I may respond to that reality. So just want to let everyone know that that's where we're coming from, and how we're going to be thinking about racism as we go forward in this session today together. So following from that, the other kind of grounding assumption is around discomfort, and leads directly from what Jax was talking about, the discomfort that we might feel in our bodies when we do this work, or even just take in this content. Jax, can you go to the next slide? So this is a quote from Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility. She offers this: when we feel discomfort, the key to moving forward is what we do with our discomfort. We can use it as a door out, blame the messenger, and disregard the message. Or we can use it as a door in by asking, why does this unsettle me? What would it mean for me if this were true? So the invitation for all of you today is to sit with the discomfort that may arise with you. Take note, do that field noting of where it shows up in your body, and when we say something, what is it that what provokes feelings in you, that provokes feelings in you. Just take note of that, just sit with that, and be open to that question, like, what would it mean for me if this were true? So that's what we would like you all to, how you like to situate yourself in this as we go forward in the work. Jax, do you want to take this one, or?
So this is a page of the COVID stats from the visible minorities right now in Alberta. This might be hard to see, so I'm just going to put the link in the chat, because it's actually really valuable data that I think would be good to see. Hold on here. Chat. And the reason why we have this up is because there is a distinction between how COVID has affected the dominant culture and racialized people. Race plays, Thulasy is going to get into that in a moment, but race plays a very designing factor in how COVID has impacted people, because of where people are situated in their work, and how exposed they are to other people in frontline positions as essential workers. And those positions often are shaped by policy, where how they immigrated into the country and how the labor markets from their home countries have established labor as a resource, an export resource. So this is as you could see, if you can, there's higher numbers in certain areas, of course. Specifically in Calgary, in the upper northeast, there are higher rates because of the way that Calgary is set up with, I guess, redlining as well. I don't know if that's a term that many people are familiar with, but that's also something to look into, how mortgages and how people gain their housing situations through their banks or renting opportunities. But we're looking at how COVID has impacted racialized communities, because everybody's impacted by COVID, period. But when you're looking at it through a racialized lens, or even race-based data, you see a different experience. So it's, even though we had a 3-day consultation with the city of Calgary on confirming that systemic racism is an actual thing, there are still people who had some doubt after that. Because, like, even the police chief, Mark Neufeld, and it took him some time to actually recognize that actually is an actual experience. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Thulasy?
I think just like to start up the session talking about something very current, talking about something that's very real, how systemic racism is not something that's out there being perpetuated in other places by other people. Again, bringing us back to the metaphor of the smog. This is something that's happening right now. It was hard as a South Asian person to hear the premier of my province scapegoating an entire community, attributing negative qualities and characteristics to entire communities of people, and blaming them for the spread of COVID in the northeast of Calgary. That for me is just an indication. It's sort of the tip of the iceberg of what we mean by systemic racism. That sort of stereotyping and prejudice that's put on entire groups of people, without actually asking the other question of, like, what are the root causes of where we see these disparities? When we see these disparities and inequities in our data, it's an invitation to ask much deeper questions about where those are coming from and what the upstream effects of them are. Jumping to individualized conclusions and just saying, well, these are just bad people, they do bad things. That's how systemic racism gets perpetuated. So I just wanted to say that this is a very real and current and present thing in our province in this moment. However, I also want to acknowledge that it also, one of the reasons we're here today, and I don't want it to go unsaid, is we're here today because of what happened in May with the murder of George Floyd and the reignition of a movement that is many decades and centuries long, the movement for Black lives and Black liberation, and all of the actions that happened as a result of that in Calgary and Edmonton, across the province and rural centers. The movement by municipalities, Jax mentioned the public consultation that happened at the city of Calgary, for example, commitments that various institutions have made to act on all of this, is one of the reasons why we're all here today, that we're here to talk very directly about racism, rather than potentially talking about this in a very indirect way through words like diversity and inclusion, which are far more comfortable and don't necessarily get to the heart of the matter, how systemic discriminations like racism are actually the key barriers, the barriers that get in the way between us and our goals around diversity and inclusion. So I wanted to name that too, that's why we're here, and that we're sitting in a context where there's this moment that we're living in, COVID, Black Lives Matter, but it stems from a very long and real history in Canada around how our country came to be, the institutions that formed it, settler colonialism, drawing back to the land acknowledgement and acknowledging that anti-Indigenous racism is very much alive and well in not just sort of everyday sort of ways, not just at the level of the encounter or in the interpersonal interaction, but all the way up to our institutional structures, including things like the Indian Act. So I think that we just wanted to really just start there, because it's really important for us to root ourselves in the local contextual reality of racism, as it is manifesting here, as it is manifesting in the air that we are breathing here on these lands. So given all of that, again, that just note how your body's feeling about that. For me, it feels like a heaviness. There's a sadness. I could just feel my shoulders just like wanting to hunch over a little bit. And it's important for us to note how this feels in this moment. We're going to talk about this later in the session, but noting how we feel will help us realize what might be getting in the way to taking action in the face of this the enormity of everything we've just described. So, yeah.
I also wanted to add to that even though the murder of George Floyd served as a catalyst for the Black Lives Matter movement protests, and in such a massive way all across North America and globally, there still were like the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls stats have been consistent since this country began, and there haven't been as much of a attention towards their cause. And so even recognizing that you can still see that there is the anti-Indigenous sentiment that Thulasy mentioned is still here. Like, so we still have to be aware of the other movements that are happening simultaneously, and the other levels of systemic oppression that keep all people who are meant to be considered Canadians not living in an equitable way.
Thanks, Jax. So we've already been throwing around a lot of words, and I want to just take a moment to clarify with you all what these words have come to mean for us in our process and how we understand them in our work. These series of photos are drawn from the work of Angelica Das, an artist who in her project Humanae went around the world and took portraits of people, and then matched their skin color to the Pantone color index. And it's really like a beautiful collage of photos. I really recommend you looking it up and listening to her TED Talk. In the way that her work was installed in this particular place, these 4 photos were put together because they all have exactly the same skin color, Pantone 58-7C. And I like using this image to describe the terms on the right: race, racialization, racism, and white supremacy. Because in as much as I like to believe that, and I do believe that there is only one race, the human race, it's very apparent, I think almost all of us could agree that these 4 people would potentially be categorized into different racial buckets or groups that are sort of vaguely defined and ever shifting, but nevertheless, we can say that the person on the top left would be white, the person on the top right would be racialized as Black, on the bottom left, maybe, Asian. Again, this is a category that means something, but also nothing. And the person on the bottom right, depending on context, could be racialized as Hispanic or potentially white. Again, these categories are not fixed. They're constantly being made. But what we do know is these categories are real, because we know that depending on how, where you are in the world, where you are in Canada, let's talk about where you are in Canada and what the context might be, these 4 people would have very different experiences when they, say, walk into an interview or are going into the doctor to see the doctor, to into a courtroom, or having an encounter with the police on the street. We know that there's an uneven effect of those different things and spaces on these 4 different people, and these 4 different categories that we're looking at right now. And that uneven distribution and the disproportionate negative impacts on certain groups over others, like what is that? So that's where we're getting at, is that race is real, like it has real world impacts on people's lives, but it's also not real. It's a social construction, as it's called, an idea that we are making, constantly making and remaking, and that is the process of racialization. It is the active process of making and remaking these buckets. Racialization, people are racialized into these categories primarily based on skin color, but I would also say not really, because these 4 people have exactly the same skin color. So racialization can happen based on other phenotypic features like hair type, eye shape, eye color, nose shape, lip shape. It can also be things like what it sounds like when these people speak English, what type of clothing they might be wearing, or any religious affiliations they might have on their body. These are all the complicated ways that people are racialized into these categories. And when they're put into these categories, it's not just about our brains assigning difference to different groups, wanting to make the world a simpler place for us to navigate. This is where racism is not just about sort of these differences. It's not just about the sort of explicit, intentional, hateful interactions they might have between people, again, at the level of the interpersonal interaction or encounter. For us, racism is fundamentally a system of power, because these 4 people would not only be grouped differently, but they would be ranked in a very specific order, and would then benefit from or be disadvantaged in the various systems that we build around them and in our world. So racism, again, a system of power. It's not an arbitrary system of power. In Canada, what's really important to name is that the system of racism that exists here, that has been created and cultivated through the process of settler colonialism, primarily from Europe, but with institutions really built from like a British Christian perspective. When we look at our government institutions, our schooling institutions, our healthcare institutions, our justice institutions, they come from a very particular standpoint. And while we may have no explicit laws that actually segregate and rank people, like in apartheid South Africa, or in Jim Crow South in the States, or in various stages of Canadian history where Indigenous peoples were actually segregated and seen as less than human, and actually still are, and it's encoded through the Indian Act in this way as our kind of most current piece of sexist and racist legislation that exists for Indigenous people. We need to realize that it's not an arbitrary ranking. The system of racism that exists in Canada is called white supremacy. And now, again, when I say those words, you might be getting a lot of feeling in your body. Maybe your back stiffening, maybe your whole body stiffening in resistance to this term, because it's associated with sort of the Ku Klux Klan and white hoods and burning crosses. And that, for me, is really just the tip of a very big iceberg. Under the water icebergs, you can't see the enormity of their size, and it's obscured by the waters. That's what it's like in Canada. And if we look at the data where it is available across all the institutions that I mentioned, you will see this uneven distribution of impact. You'll see disproportionate negative impacts on people that are Black, Indigenous, or racialized. I use those terms very specifically. Black to talk about the specific history and experience of anti-Black racism, Indigenous for the very specific political kind of reclamation of that term on these lands, and racialized as sort of being a person that is racialized. I am not essentially different. I am not essentially a brown woman, but that is how I am racialized in the world. And the reason why I don't use the term racialized for white people, even though they are racialized as well into a vague social category, under conditions of white supremacy, they are not seen as white people, they are seen as people, as humans. A test for me in like proving this, I guess, in a way, is when I'm constantly asked where I'm from, and it's not enough to say that I was born and raised in Edmonton, or that I'm Canadian. It needs to be qualified that I am a Sri Lankan Tamil Canadian, child of immigrants, that story needs to be told in order to validate my existence on these lands. Whereas for many other people that find themselves on the top of this racial hierarchy, saying they're just Canadian is all that is needed. So for me, that's what the white supremacy becomes real in that moment for me. So these are really important terms for us to hold the discomfort and tension that will arise because of them. Again, the invitation is to you all. You don't have to accept them to be true, but the question is, what would it mean for you if they were? So, Jax, anything that you would add to those 4 terms?
I think adding to what you were saying about how diversity inclusion is much more comfortable is because as Canadians, we usually don't talk about race like until this year, like where we actually have this time to look at ourselves and have the time to actually self-reflect because of COVID, because we're all working at home, most of us, many, and also because of this cultural revolution where we're at an unprecedented time of reckoning with racial justice. And it's, we're often compared to the States where, oh, Canadians are much nicer, but the racism that is perpetuated in Canada is often a bit more insidious in that we're much more polite. And that in itself can also be disguised as microaggressions, different ways of how normalizing white culture or the dominant culture, even myself, is can be more oppressive to someone who's racialized. I grew up in Calgary and in Southwest Calgary, where I was probably usually the only racialized person in the class, and that made me assimilate into what is considered the dominant culture, and that also is harmful. So moving in this conversation for this duration, I hope that we could build that understanding of how damaging the erasure of one's own identity in a cultural aspect can be. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say for that.
Erin, Justin, are there any questions that might be, maybe this is the time to pause and just maybe take some questions if anyone has any about what's been presented so far? See, there's a few here.
Oh, can you see them yourself? Do you want to?
Maybe I'll let you go through them and ask them. It's kind of overwhelming to see everything at once.
Okay, maybe for now we'll go with the first one, which was, I think, in relation to some things you were saying closer to the beginning, which is providing data and facts racism.
It's a good question. I was at a racism and policing presentation by Desmond Cole, I want to say 3 years ago in Calgary. And he talked about how calls to collect data on racism and be really race aware in our data collection is important because when we don't know what we're looking at, we don't know how to solve the problem. And so it's important to be really race aware and collect race-based data, understanding that that's not the only way people identify and that's not their total existence, but that it's real. But he said our reliance on data and facts obscures the fact that so many individuals and communities have across the history of Canada come forward at great cost to tell us of their experiences of racism. And that those sort of, what we call qualitative data or anecdotal accounts have never been taken seriously. And part of us to be anti-racist is to really hear and listen to those accounts, because again, they come forward in a way at great cost. There are great consequences to sharing stories like that, and yet there are many for us to listen to and hear. So I don't think that it is racist to actually collect data. I think it's actually racist to not listen to the stories in a way. That would be my answer to that question.
I also wanted to add that in the art sector in Alberta, we have begun actually there have been artist initiated audits of each artist-run center and gallery of how many Black, Indigenous, racialized artists have been presented or represented and exhibited in those spaces. And to note those low numbers is valuable in understanding how programming, representation, and leadership on boards can shift to a more authentic lens of who and what gets exhibited in those spaces. So there is great value in having race-based data But again, what Thulasy was saying specifically about those consultations and testimonials that were represented at the anti-race or the systemic racism 3-day consultation, it was they can be very traumatic. So yeah, please do take note of the qualitative data. It takes a lot of energy.
All right. Would you like another question?
Let's take one more and then we'll get on.
So it says, in speaking about the question of where are you from, how do I as a white woman balance the respect for cultural practices and beliefs without identifying someone's ethnic background?
That's a good question. I have a lot to say. I've often said that I could probably talk about the question, where are you from, for like 3 hours if I had to. Again, the question, where are you from, is so othering. And so it just makes this immediate assumption that you are not from here and don't belong here. And so what we want to do and what we're asking people to do is to not be race oblivious or colorblind, as I think we often like to think ourselves. We need to be really aware that our brains are creating these social categories, replicating these social categories, putting people into them unconsciously. Unconscious bias is by definition something that we cannot understand or reveal on our own. Like, I can't just sit here and be like, I wonder what my biases are. They need to be revealed through active processes, like taking an implicit association test on the Project Implicit website. For example. And so what we try to emphasize is that it's really important for us to be race aware, to understand that race is a real thing and that people are going to be that our brains are putting people into social categories. But we don't need to use now those as new boxes in which to put people in, you know what I mean? Like, we want to be able to be race aware, but not use those to almost use that awareness to be anti-racist and take actions to dismantle those boxes that people get put in. But to your question directly, for me, it's all about when you're working in relationship with people. That question and that desire to understand more fully how someone identifies can only be done in the context of a really good relationship. And we're going to talk about relationships a little bit later on. Trustful and strong relationships in which you can talk about the multiplicity of ways people identify. At our board of directors, we've done this several times, where we go around the circle in a listening circle format and kind of a quote unquote, safe space in which to say what I want to say about who I am. And I think what's really important in those spaces, or even in those conversations, is to accept the answer you get. So if I say I'm from Edmonton and I leave it at that, it's really important to accept that. It may be a recognition that that's how the person wants to be seen and identify as. So it's not easy territory, but I think there's a lot of skill building that can be done to, again, be aware of our biases and also enter into those relationships in ways that allow people to show up as who they are. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And also to add to what Thulasy was saying about how ethnocultural introductions, when you first, begin a group, whether it's ad hoc or your workspace or even in meetings, I like to build those ethnocultural introductions after you even do the land acknowledgement, because it recognizes your settler privilege if you are not Indigenous, and also understanding your relationship to the land and your navigation of how you're building relationships with First Nations, with understanding yourself as a treaty person. Like, where are you at? I've worked with newcomer agencies, and that is even between newcomer populations and people, we ask, like, where are you from? And many people appreciate that because they want to relate. But we need to move away from trying to identify where people are from rather than who they are, because that's how you want to meet people. When you know that they're from Calgary, or if they're from Edmonton, if they're white, you don't ask them that. It's often like, what other languages do you speak? What are your favorite foods? Instead of learn how to ask questions about someone, how you would ask people who are from here, I guess. Because then
I was about to say, like, when someone asks me where I'm from, I immediately ask, oh, where are you from? It's like before I even answer the question, I ask them where they're from, because it just turns the table and read that. The asymmetry of experience becomes so apparent. Some people get asked this question every single day, and some people never get asked this question, even if they are also the children of immigrants, for example. So there's like that asymmetry of experience, and sometimes just making that really apparent in the interaction can, I guess it could ratchet up the tension. Sometimes it can diffuse it, and you can move forward in that. So thanks, Jax. Maybe we'll like hold on questions. There'll be other opportunities for to check in with the questions, and we're going to move on to kind of further complexifying these concepts by introducing the concept of intersectionality.
So we're going to watch a video from COCO, the community organization's collective, or they're from Montreal. But anyways, coco-net.org, an amazing resource for anti-racism and in the workplace. So this is a video that we're going to watch, and then we'll talk about it in a minute.
Today, we meet Iman. Iman loves coffee, salads, and deeply identifies with her sign Libra. She has a supportive community of friends and family. Iman has one brother, 2 living parents, and 2 young children. Depending on context, she identifies as a proud Montrealer. She has used the terms visible minority or person of color, but now mainly identifies herself as a Black woman. For her, these are the 2 parts of her identity that speak to her the most: to be Black and to be a woman. Her journey has been marked with many triumphs and tribulations. The start to her career was rockier than expected after completing her undergraduate degree. She moved between short-term contracts and part-time work in the nonprofit sector. She realized that her life wouldn't follow the expected university to successful career narrative. After graduating with a master's in social work, she started a permanent job at a local nonprofit supporting single mothers. Her first few weeks were motivating and challenging. She felt welcomed. She had a cordial relationship with her colleagues, the majority of whom were white, and she had a lot of passion for her work. After a few weeks, she began to notice dynamics that made her feel uneasy. She began to wonder, was I just a token diversity hire, or was I hired for my skills and experience? Every time there was a new racialized client, they were automatically referred to her. As Iman was talking to a colleague of color, a white colleague walked by them and said, "I guess this must be the Cultural Diversity Office." Her ideas in team meetings were often not taken seriously or dismissed without due consideration. She was infantilized by her coworkers. When she would assert herself, her colleagues would tell her to calm down and that there was no need to be so aggressive. Finally, she decided to meet with human resources to strategize about how to deal with these experiences. After all, the HR coordinator had repeatedly encouraged Iman to go see her if she had any issues that she wanted to discuss confidentially. The HR coordinator responded, "But that's not possible. We are a community organization. Nobody on the team wants to hurt anyone. You're too sensitive. Our workplace has always been welcoming to everyone. The other immigrant staff have never complained. How can you say there are racist dynamics?" She says to herself, "I keep on being read as angry or aggressive. I have often been in situations where I am wary of how I will be seen, that I have to compensate so much that I undermine what I am trying to accomplish." In the following days, the HR coordinator discusses Iman's situation with the executive director, who calls a meeting with Iman. The executive director says, "There may be problematic dynamics now and then, but no one was intending to say hurtful things. It's a lack of education. Maybe you could provide a training on diversity and inclusion?" Iman feels very anxious. She is very familiar with this dynamic, having worked in the community sector for over a decade. Organizations often say that it's a priority to hire people of color, but once hired, there are no resources to support us, and we are forced to fit into a mold that is palatable to the interests of the organization. Over the next few weeks, Iman takes on organizing training sessions and convening discussions with her colleagues on current dynamics and racial microaggressions. At first, there seems to be openness, but over time, Iman notices that the microaggressions did not stop. On top of it all, the team continues to expect her to educate them about any and all diversity and race-related issues, even informally outside the work context. She says to herself, "Even if you do not like your job, it's not something you can escape. You and your family need it to live. When someone says something racist in the streets, you can always cross the street, but you can't change jobs so easily. There is a certain captivity to the workplace." Today, the story actually begins before Iman enters the organization. This isn't a utopia. Race and gender dynamics still exist. However, there is an organization that has taken the time to look within. They challenge themselves and foster conditions wherein Black, Indigenous, and other women and femmes of color will be seen and heard. When Iman enters, her skill sets and lived experiences are honored and appreciated. She isn't expected to take on all race-related matters. There is enough integrated knowledge of diversity and anti-racism practices on the team. She feels trusted. She knows that she can raise issues if they arise, and that her colleagues will provide thoughtful and considerate feedback. If there is conflict, there are clear ways to address them. Work is work, and so it isn't always easy, but she is paid a living wage. She has access to benefits and can leave her work at the office while holding on to feelings of being appreciated and honored. Over time, Iman gains new skills and can see how her contributions help the organization change for the better. She has a positive impact on the community. She stays in the organization because she chooses to. Over the years, she meets and mentors other Black women and femmes in the sector, and together, they learn, grow, and heal.
That was great. That was actually the first time I ever saw that video, because normally I actually just show this diagram. Yeah. So yeah, I have a podcast that was launched and funded by the Calgary Foundation, which also funds the funded AROC, called the Unlearning Channel. If you want to check it out, we just posted this on there, and so many people responded to it in alignment, in anger, in frustration, in seeing themselves as that woman of color, as Iman, in different ways of identities through their intersectional experience and lived experiences. Just to understand that this is the diagram talks about Iman as someone who's othered by her race and her religion. And there are other ways that other people get othered or tokenized, whether it's through their gender, through their sexual orientation, through their abilities, and this needs to be the term intersectionality needs to be really understood, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in '98, but was informed by the Coombahi River Collective from the '70s, a radical Black feminist group who actually created identity politics so that we can understand people, how systemic racism, how oppression actually affects people in different ways through their different identities. And specifically for the way that Iman was experiencing it, I think not many people understand how tokenization can be so harmful. And that, which is why diversity and inclusion often aren't enough. If you don't have equity in mind, if you don't have the understanding that the space that you invite people into, for like, what are you including people into? It has to be a space where they have resources, they have a grievance process where they would feel safe to report any experiences of microaggressions or harm, and where there is a generative process so that they can have their input dynamically responded to by leadership, and not feel like they're being blamed for their lived experience, for what the reality is different, where it's different for them as opposed to someone who's white, straight, cis gendered. Yeah, so that I think that maybe we should take questions, or do you want to add something to that, Thulasy?
Yeah, I think that intersectionality really diffracts the concept of racism into like a multitude of experiences, and the demands of intersectionality, that word, are for us as organizations to be really not just aware of those multitude of experiences, but to build structures that account for them so that they do not like kind of literally fall through the cracks, and are sort of unseen or invisibilized by our work. So as organizations that may be in the business of serving everyone, quote unquote, everyone in the community, how are we actually actively doing that? By understanding these very specific experiences and responding to them in ways that are really aware of their situatedness, the ways in which they are situated in the world and in the community, and respond accordingly. That's what equity is really all about. So intersectionality for me is a really, it's a high bar. It's like a really big thing for us to live up to. Even at CommunityWise, I don't throw out that word. I don't, oh, we're an intersectional organization. I don't throw it out that easily, because it is something that I feel like needs to be backed up by pretty like tangible actions and structures that people are doing to account for those experiences for us. So for me, it's like, it's a really good sort of guide. It's a guiding for me, a guiding principle around this work. Yeah, so maybe Erin, Justin, if there's like a question that would be like kind of relevant to where we are in this presentation right now, that would be good to answer.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions specifically on board recruitment,
Right.
and looking for, you know, whether you use the language diversity, inclusivity, and so you know, of course, being able to create that space where some of these voices are heard. Do you have any advice that people who are, I guess, looking and recruiting for board members?
Right. I would say there's kind of like an internal facing question there and an external facing question. So when a board looks around at themselves and they realize that they don't have a level of diversity that is reflective of the community that they serve, and are looking to, you know, bring in more diversity into their organization, I think we need to go back to what Jack said about what are we including them into. And the video also talks about, in that second scenario, how organizations ready the ground, prepare, they've done some work internally so that there is no replication of this problem women of color in the workplace scenario, that they've kind of done things, active things, to make the space a more welcoming and inclusive one. Doing things like there's kind of small things like making sure that there's like a childcare or transit allowance, food at the meetings, you know, when we were meeting in person. Those are maybe like sort of things that make the space, like making meeting times not just in the middle of the day, but like at a time that works for everyone that's involved. But then there's other structural things you can do inside that space, like having a decision-making process that is really clear to everyone, that actually makes time and space for everyone's voices to be heard in the ways that they want their voices to be heard. This actually slows down a decision processing quite a bit. It can feel inefficient, but it's highly effective. You're going to make better decisions. You're going to be able to account for biases. The best way to combat bias in a process is to slow it down. And so there are just ways in which we can build processes where people can be really open about where and when they may have reservations about a decision or a proposal that an organization is making, or just be able to champion something without feeling like they won't be heard. So that's like all that internal facing piece around like how are we readying the space so that when we bring in the word diversity, I think we think it's like this really beautiful word, but when we really think about it, it is beautiful. And also when you bring diversity into a space, you are going to increase the levels of conflict in a space. It's really important for us to acknowledge that the conflict is going to go up. Do we have skills in dealing with different levels of conflict? Can we tolerate it, or do we live in an open fear of conflict? Do we have skills to deal with this? I always say, I'll never forget, I heard Shawneen Pete, an Indigenous educator in Saskatchewan, talk about how Indigenous people have incredible conflict management skills because they have to deal with conflict so much in their lives. And so this is where having that representation in the room actually helps deal with some, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. It can help deal with those problems as they arise, helps build that capacity and that muscle around managing conflict in a really productive and constructive way. The external facing piece around recruiting board members is, again, looking at the diversity of your organization and who it is you purport to serve, and making sure you see that lived experience reflected in your governance structures. For me, that's a long game exercise in relationship building. So when you've done a lot of work in the community to build strong relationships across different variables of kind of difference and identity, when it comes time to recruit board members, you're going to have people that are going to walk into your space and want to be a part of your organization. So it's not an easy answer to the question, because it's actually like a really like a long-term sort of thing around relationship building. And I keep mentioning that I'm going to talk about it. We'll talk about it shortly. Understanding that being on a board in the voluntary sector in Alberta it's a voluntary position. It's unpaid. You can't actually even pay people or compensate for their time. And so understanding that there may need to be other ways in which people get to be a part of your governance structure. And we have used advisory groups. We have an Indigenous advisory group. We have an AROC advisory group, sort of extra board structures that I would say they count for governance because they're holding us accountable to the things that we think are really important. Those are other ways to include people that don't require them to come to a board meeting every month, for 8 months of the year, or whatever the terms of reference may be, because sometimes that can be a lot for people that are already doing really important work in their communities. Sorry, it's a long answer. Jax?
Yeah, I would also want to add that if for organizations that receive operational funding, build a line item for equity, and address the items that Thulasy mentioned, whether it's for board meetings, for food, also building honoraria for elders, for those committees that your organization would need. Because, and keep in mind that if you do consultations, if you hire a focus group or a community-based participatory action research group, consultation doesn't need consent. So that relationship building also deepens your racial justice lens and understanding what would be equitable for the communities that you're serving, because it isn't just these one bullet fixes. It's a process. I mean, even with CommunityWise in the anti-racist organizational change process, it's taken 4 years to establish a certain amount of trust within the groups, and a kind of a flow of an understanding of what process can look like for any sort of grievance, or even how to adapt and how to address issues that come up in the moment. A board that I'm on right now, having a line item for consultations for a consultant on how to build transformative justice into those processes is extremely valuable, especially if you're working with people who are from marginalized communities, because there are so many different lenses of experience that can impact how someone can contribute, even at a board level, even as someone like in the executive. So yeah, it takes a lot of preparation to have a space where you can move forward bravely.
Thanks for that question. We're gonna keep moving because there's like a lot of things we want to cover. I think might answer some of these questions. So let's get into, so we've kind of described a lot of the nature of the sort of problem of racism, and I feel a bit rushed because I think in a normal training situation, we would spend a lot more time kind of digging through like what exactly does systemic racism mean? What does it look like? And I think there's some questions there around those sorts of things. So I apologize for sort of moving through it really quickly. But what we wanted to offer you today is sort of like, well, what can we do about it as organizations, as nonprofits, as grassroots groups? What is the active orientation now, if we're going to look at anti-racism as something that's active rather than something that is race neutral, race oblivious, race passive? How do we move into that anti-racist sort of stance? And so we want to share with you a little bit about what anti-racist organizational change, or AROC, has meant for us. Organizational change of any kind, if you go to the next slide, is about changing management structures, and procedures, making changes to policy, practices, governance. For example, organizational change can mean many different things. It can mean switching over to a new software, for example. And for anyone that's actually been a part of such a process, knows that even switching over to a new software can be so uncomfortable for people that the organization just snaps back to the way they like to do things before. And so that experience of snapback is the organization it likes to retain its shape. It wants to stay the same. And so any organizational change is going to encounter that resistance. But here we are proposing something called anti-racist organizational change, making those sorts of structural changes inside an organization in a way that actually intentionally addresses organizational racism and creates greater diversity, inclusion, and equity. For us, anti-racism has been a set of principles that's allowed us to center race explicitly, but not exclusively. So really looking at that diffraction of race through the intersectionality framework and analysis, using that as a way for us to inform actions that can create greater diversity, again, on our board or on our staff or in our membership, create a greater sense of inclusion, against not that sense of inclusion that's like, yes, you can join us and do what we're doing, more like let's co-create something together in which everyone feels like they belong. There's the Brené Brown quote that's like, what is it? Fitting in is the opposite of belonging. That's not inclusion. Fitting in is not inclusion. We don't want to have people to fit into our organizations. We want to be able to create a space where everyone can have a sense of that they can make that space something that they can belong into. And equity, again, as I mentioned before, that responsiveness, that responsivity to diversity in all the different forms it shows up. So anti-racist organizational change is something very specific. And the definition of organizational racism is on the next slide. It's quite long. I'll read it out. What we understand organization. Oh, Jax, do you want to say equity? A piece about equity? Because I just kind of jumped over that, but you can collaborate.
Sorry. Yeah, we keep talking about equity, and it is the removal of systemic barriers, because often I think we conflate equity with equality. And it isn't just offering the same opportunities. It's also understanding why there are differences in opportunities and how that they present themselves to different lived experiences. So understanding where an organization can change their policies, their governance. We're going to get into that in a few slides, but structurally, what organizational change examines is how equity can be achieved. And it's a process. It's not just changing a few things here and there. It's changing a culture even. And that begins with each one of us, with how we see ourselves in the dynamic of treaty people, and how we look at systemic racism personally and experience it, and how we contribute to it, and sometimes are complicit to it. So what I mean by systemic barriers is like structures that are in place, whether it's education, the government, or like healthcare, policing. All of these systems have ways of operating so certain people are treated differently, just by their race, just by their education, or even abilities. Even if we're talking about built environment, if we're looking at restrooms or even ramps entering a building, these are all ways of how we normalize the dominant culture and expect everybody to assimilate into the way that able-bodied, neurotypical, cisgendered, even English-speaking white people move in Canada. So yeah, that's just to give a background on equity.
Thank you, Jax. Organizational racism. So it refers to the way normal, seemingly neutral or objective organizational policies and systems can create disparities in access and outcomes for racialized and Indigenous individuals and communities. If not addressed, these policies and systems can increase disparities in power, again, referring back to racism as a system of power. It refers to organizational practices which is related to but different from the racist behavior or unconscious bias of individuals, which relates back to what Jax was saying. We all have a role to play, but we don't want to rely on sort of the Herculean sort of task that we put on people's individual shoulders for us to move through this work. We want to be able to look at the actual unwritten rules about the way we do things in organizations, the way we hire people, the way we recruit board members, the way we develop programming, the way we make decisions, etc. Just the ways that we do things. Every organization has this. There's the way we say things like kind of on our headline documents, like on our website. And then there's the way we really do things. And even at CommunityWise, it's like, oh, that's just the way we do things at CommunityWise. Well, where is that written? Where did that come to be? How did that come to be? Who set that norm? Who is that norm set for? And so on and so forth. So it's a real interrogation of those ways that we do things. Go to the next slide. Anti-racism as an antidote to this, I've already kind of mentioned it, and it's an active, ongoing process of dismantling systems of racial inequity, creating new systems of racial equity. This work needs to be done at the individual, institutional, and cultural levels for it to be kind of effectively address what we call systemic racism, something that's happening at multiple levels at the same time. In this space with Board Leadership Calgary, we're looking at the locus of control, or the sphere of influence that a nonprofit has. Like, what do we have control over as organizations inside our own spaces, inside our own organizations, inside our own programming, for example? There's a lot that we can do. Anti-racism is an approach. Jack said this as well, not an endpoint, and it provides a useful framework for organizational change. So what is that framework? I'm going to quickly go through this because it's describing this process as an emergent strategy, as something, again, I said at the beginning, we started off this as learners. Let's hold true to the principles of anti-racism and see what happens. Learn, respond, and go forward. So this sort of process, I sort of distilled it down into 3 steps. I think it's on the next slide. Right. So 3 steps, a sort of emergent process that starts with centering the experiences of your stakeholders who identify as Black, Indigenous, and racialized. I would say nonprofits in general are quite good at sort of like reflexively moving into this space. They're going to form a committee, get an advisory group together, do some community consultation, do some community outreach, get some community input. Like we do these things, but it's sort of typically done in a way that's quite extractive. Like, tell us about your experiences, give us your recommendations, and we may or may not do anything about it. And so instead of headlining this kind of engagement or consultation, I headlined it relationships, because at CommunityWise, we learned through the process of our Indigenous advisory group, through our AROC advisory working groups and advisory groups, that it was the primary function of those spaces and those interactions was relationship building. Our AROC advisory group met for 2 years every other month to really work through how racism was showing up inside organizations like ours and what we can do about it. And it's that formed the engine, or sort of the core of our process as we went forward. And so those relationships are still, like, Jax came to one of the first meetings and is now, so the relationship is so great. And board members some of our board members would say the same thing, have said the same thing. But what we want to do is so in the context of good relationship, you're going to get really interesting recommendations about what you should do as an organization, which leads to the second step, which is to simply do the things these people are asking you to do and take informed anti-racist action. To hold yourself accountable to those relationships, to those experiences, to the stories people have told you, and the gifts that they have given you in terms of their recommendations. Now, I will say, if your relationships are not in a good place, the recommendations you get are going to be tough to swallow, because there's going to be an animosity, a sort of like, we want the ED to step down, we want the whole board of directors to dissolve, we want this organization to not exist. Like, that's the level of anger that can arise in a community. But if your relationships are in a good place, or even if there's an openness to building relationship, the actions that people will ask you to take will also be a lot easier to swallow, a lot easier to take on, and also there'll be a willingness to help with that. I will say that relationships are really the core of all of this. But there is a big gap between this first step and the second step, and it is called the principle implementation gap, where on principle, people will be like, yes, racism is bad, we should do something about it. But as soon as those recommendations come in, whether they're the hard to swallow ones or the easier to swallow ones, levels of opposition rise. And that the resistance to change becomes so high that nothing gets done. And so what's really important, and we've already talked about this so many times, is to like really gauge where your feelings are around centering the experiences of these people, building those relationships, and then and acting on their recommendations and holding yourself accountable so you can close that gap. But finally, the third step that closes the loop on this, and I would say is like kind of the fundamental muscle or ethic that like runs in the background of this process, is your ability as an organization and as individuals to evaluate and reflect on your efforts, can consider where you may need to recover and repair, engaging in an ongoing learning exercise, an activity, a muscle building exercise, because we're never going to get it right. And in fact, it's not really about getting it right. It's about learning, reflecting, trying again next time, going back to those relationships. At CommunityWise, I would say that I don't think that we have always gotten it right, but we've always been able to say, hey, can you give us some feedback on what's going on? What can we do better next time? And then actually being responsive to all of that. And so it becomes a bit of a virtuous cycle. Again, in this 3-step cycle, I'm not giving you any like sort of specific tactical things to do, because that should come from your community. Your community is going to know best around the things that you should do as an organization. And where there's good relationships and good trust, you're going to get some really good recommendations. So that's AROC as an emergent process that I think organizations were, again, asking, like, what would it mean for you to undertake something like this? What would it mean for you to go to your community with this sort of process in mind? The last thing that we're going to, before we take maybe a quick like pause, is the site of action for all of these sorts of, for this process, is what we would call the organizational onion. So thinking of your organization as an onion with multiple different layers made up of multiple different systems. And so I'm going to pass it to jaqs to sort of explain that piece.
Thanks, Thulasy. A lot of information. I hope you're checking in on your tuning fork right now, where you're feeling all of this. I've also asked Justin to share a document on white supremacy culture, white supremacist culture in the workplace from COCO, the organization that we linked you to, the Center for Community Organizations in Montreal. And it'll give you some insight on how white supremacist culture impacts every level of this onion that we're looking at. So we're going to start at in the center of the onion, which is culture, norms, and unwritten rules. And this is where unspoken understandings of what's acceptable in your organization it often is perpetuated by leadership, by management, or by people who've established the organization from the beginning of its creation. And whether it's microaggressions or whether it's like light racist jokes where, you could say those things because it's funny. Oh, why are you so sensitive? No, you really need to be mindful of how that impacts people on a very, on a daily basis. If you have to be the receiver of those, it can take a toll on how you can show up at work, as we saw with the problem of color scenario. So though the culture, norms, and unwritten rules build into how identity and values can play into your vision, mission, and purpose. What do you want to achieve for your community? What is this organization about? Is it representing Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ people? Is this for newcomers? Are you looking to provide services for whatever area? Like, you need to understand, how do you want to build that? Are you looking to establish diversity and inclusion? Are you looking to be equitable? And if you're going to say you're going to be intersectional, you really need to understand what that means. There is such a great amount of responsibility that comes with that, as Thulasy said, when you use terms like intersectionality, when you use terms like anti-racism, because then those terms you could be held accountable to. Diversity and inclusion, those are numbers that can be easily presented through hiring practices, yes, but examining the turnover rate, which we'll get over to in hiring, that speaks volumes of how, what's the retention rate that your organization has. So identity and values, mission and purpose, then go into your theory of change. They shape your strategic plan. And usually organizations have 2 to 3 year terms for these strategic plans. And they don't change over that period. Some organizations or institutions have had them, their strategic plans stretched over like 5 years. But now, considering how much happens within a month, shorter term strategic plans are far more valuable to be more dynamically responsive to what happens culturally, to what happens in your community, so that you are building an emergent strategy. That book, Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, is such a great resource, and to understand that you can make mistakes, that moving with the expert model hinders you from being able to be adaptable. And the expert model also maintains the idea that status quo is the best way to flow. But in order to respond more dynamically to your community's needs, listening, being able to learn by trial and error, and holding these conversations and taking time, resisting the need to respond with such urgency that you harm people with a lens that may not be as inclusive or equitable as it can be. So going into governance, those are your policies, procedures, bylaws that shape the processes that your employees, your internal stakeholders can use in holding your organization accountable to their needs. So if you're looking at like representation of gender parity, I just saw like a GBA plus question in like the questions. If there are instances of like sexual harassment or even like comments of sexism, how does your organization respond to that? That has to be explicit in the governance process, like in your policies. Even experience of racism, like how are you protecting the people who are needing to voice their concerns, or are they going to be harmed in that process and just ejected because they're not playing along with the unwritten rules of the culture that was established before they got there? Monitoring and evaluation. So this is what the advisory committees that Thulasy was mentioning can play into as valuable role. They can, like, whether it's advisory committees or an external organization or group, like here in Calgary, we have the Black Leadership Advisory Council through CommunityWise that came through the advisory group. Like they're being asked to adjudicate or even assess many processes in Calgary right now. And that's where also you can build a line for honorarium, so to make sure that people who do this type of work are being paid. And monitoring evaluation is also should be also part of your strategic plan, where you can examine how have we done in achieving the goals that we committed to publicly, internally, and then share those wins, and also share the opportunities where you can be more adapted to equitable processes. So for finance, this is also, again, part of like that budget line, like the line item in if you have operational funding, or even how you fundraise. Like, are you doing it equitably in the sense that are you being extractive? Are you also even looking at who's financing you? Because then you might be even beholden to certain philosophies and values that your funders expect you to uphold and share. And even with the Calgary, like how grants are being put out, or if you're offering grants or offering like mentorships, or even offering any sort of resource where you would have to put up money for the community, are they being put out in an equitable way? So then this is where we look at human resources in how people are hired on. I think the postings even, like I'm going to get to the hiring, but who are you looking for and can shape the culture of an organization. Um, like for example, like Baja Kare, very small grassroots, like they're so tiny, but we want people to have an anti-racist lens. We want people to have a racial justice lens before they even get in there. Because, you know, if you're trying to change the people already on board, that takes a greater amount of resource. And there isn't buy-in often sometimes, but when you shape your organization with the intention of selecting people who have those skill sets and even valuing lived experience over over institutional credentials, that can also shape how you bring people into an organization. I've even, like for example, like CommunityWise, Thulasy was part of the hiring processes for many positions that come through, like for AROC, and they actually have very like pleasant experiences of process for human resources, like making sure that people are contacted like throughout the process to understand where they're at, and if they don't get the position, make sure they know why, and that's an opportunity for them to build on their skill sets. So hiring, how are these postings going out? Are you only sharing them with the with, you know, your regular list or Instagram group or Facebook community or mailing list? How are you expanding that engagement so that you're communicating and building relationships with organizations that could benefit from your services and understanding that what you actually offer? And how the posting is offered shapes how people even respond. Like if there's a diversity clause, that you are intentionally looking for people who are BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color, or with different abilities, that is an intention of building a more diverse recruitment. And then in built environment, this is where we're talking about with ramps, like for accessibility, or even gender, like non-gendered restrooms. And also even now when we're in the Zoom is very, it rewards people who are quick, who think quickly and actually respond in a certain way, who are extroverted and know how to take up space. So, but when you're mindful of how people learn, having a slide deck is also part of this built environment now, or having accessibility needs met, like do your stakeholders or does your audience need ASL or like auto interpretation, like online interpretation? Being more mindful of how this built environment, like this Zoom world we live in, is also going to shape how you reach your stakeholders. So for programs and workshops, this is also a really easy entry point for diversity inclusion. When you're working with, I mean, predominantly white institutions where most of the leadership, most of the board are white, and you want to build a diversity factor into your organization, programming is often where that entry point begins. And you'll see that most people who with a diverse lived experience or who are racialized will be put in a programming position on contract, on short-term contract, and they will shape how an organization looks to the community, and then they're let go after the contract ends, or they might even leave on their own terms because that organization has not considered how that they can be equitable in keeping them safe in that space. So like there's a lot to say about this, but workshops and programming is an entry point. And I'm saying that because when you hire somebody who is racialized or who is Black and Indigenous into those contract positions, going back to human resources, you're not keeping them for a longer term. They're not part of the process of shaping and creating an organization that has values aligned with anti-racism and equity. Their input is only there for a short interim, and then they're gone. And when you replace them with another person of the similar lived experience, then that's not really allowing a long-term commitment or I guess input again consistently. So I hope that organizations out there who are predominantly white understand that you need to have representation in leadership to shift not only all of these layers, but to have an input with a racial justice lens. And I want to also add that just because someone is racialized doesn't necessarily mean they have a racial justice lens. And sometimes people who are racialized don't feel that they feel brave enough to even exercise that lens. If you're on a board, they don't feel safe. So this takes a lot of shared language that needs to be established from the top down. And so that all stakeholders, even from to front facing, where we get to in external communications or even programs, understand that this is what the culture is perpetuating. When we get to external communications, again, there's often a racialized person or someone of different abilities or different gender or different sexual orientation who will be in that position, and then they will be the front-facing lens that the public will be exposed to, and that's again admin. That's sometimes a short-term contract. But external communications is often a way for organizations to also sometimes be performative in that. And what I mean by performative is that like perhaps putting out a statement of racial justice, like alignment with racial justice, but not reshaping how internally the content that they share is aligning with those values. Like, for example, I was a film instructor for an organization that is an institute down in Los Angeles, and they put out a statement after George Floyd's murder about racial justice. And then looking at the content that I was supposed to teach these students, it was so contradictory and actually ridiculous to even say that they have a racial justice alignment. So you really have to make sure that if you're going to put a statement out or put out diversity, inclusion as part of your values, that you actually are building that into the culture from the inside out. It can't just be something that you hire on and then you don't have to deal with. Like from the executive director to the front-facing stakeholders, they have to be aware of the values that are being shared. Is there anything you want to add to that? I kind of went really long.
No, I think there's just so much to say. And I think this is where we took this onion to our community, to that first step of the process, and asked, like, how is racism showing up in our organization? What can we do about it? And I think this is just a framework you can use to make sure that you're being thorough about it rather than being comfortable, which kind of leads to our next little framework. It's a new tool that we're developing. Let's consider this a prototype for for locating where your organization may be right now in feeling your way through this moment and how you want to respond. This is not a perfect framework. Like I said, it's a prototype, and it'd be great to get your feedback on it. We're going to take a little poll in a bit to ask you about this. So give us a bit of grace there. We're just trying to illuminate certain pieces of this work that we encounter when organizations, they see that three-step cycle, they see the onion, and then they're flooded with certain feelings. And so on this left column, you have organizations that are flooded with a sense of fear, whether they know it or not. And because anti-racism is an active orientation and approach, we wanted to really highlight the difference between organizations that take action and those that don't take action. So those that are motivated by fear and are also inactive, they're petrified. They are, I'm gonna have a little bit of wordage on this. They are either afraid of revealing their historic or current racism, or they are afraid of doing the wrong thing to address it. Either way, they are held back by feelings of shame or guilt, and their focus ends up being entirely on themselves. They say they may be listening and learning or having conversations or not rushing into things, but all of this just serves to maintain the status quo. So these are organizations that kind of are hearing all of this, but are now feeling unable to do something about it, as represented by these emoji. We tried our best. There's limited options. Fear-based responses that are active in nature, Jack's actually mentioned a lot of these in talking about those surface layers of the onion where action will be taken almost immediately. These organizations are afraid of actually looking bad, and they spring into action to protect their image. They will do work at the surface layers of their onion, potentially at external communications level, maybe at the work of programming or work in community, or maybe even in hiring. But they are unwilling to shift power and change the culture within their organization. Racism is a system of power, again. We're not just looking for more visual representations of diversity. We're looking for shifts in who holds power and the ways those power structures are actually built. So these organizations are not actually interested in doing those things. They're not interested in shifting power. They're not interested in changing culture. And so this actually has the effect of entrenching racism within an organization rather than disrupting it. So we'd call them performative. So these are organizations are kind of flooded with that fear. On the right column, you've got organizations that maybe don't have an immediate fear response, but they're more motivated and aligned with the values of anti-racism. They feel compelled because they know it's the right thing to do. But still, even in this category, you see organizations that don't take action. They're sort of inactive in the face of all of this. And so we're calling these organizations perpetuating organizations. They see themselves as aligned with the principles of anti-racism and intersectionality, but they actually are conflating understanding these concepts in theory with actually putting them into practice. So they might have a lens or an analysis, but they're not actually putting it into practice. Often these organizations work in service of marginalized communities and causes. So they might be working on women's issues, immigrants' services, people living in poverty, the environment, etc. So they see themselves often as already doing good work, hence the halo. They kind of feel like we're already doing the right things. We're already on the right side of this. But that becomes almost a way for them to dodge or bypass addressing racism very directly, or they see it as sort of incidental and not essential to their core work. So they kind of see we're doing this thing over here and racism is this thing over here, and we don't really do both of these things. Whereas we kind of see it as a strategy that can actually improve and make more effective the work any organization does. So perpetuating organizations, they have the facade and the feeling of like doing the right thing, but actually are not actively moving towards it, which moves us to the porous organizations. These organizations are willing to enter into the discomfort of taking action, anti-racist action, in deep and tangible ways. So they're looking into the core of their onion and actually making changes there. They hold themselves accountable to their Indigenous, Black, and racialized stakeholders. At CommunityWise, we've actually developed a little bit of a test on some of our proposals and decision making that asks ourselves, whose comfort are we prioritizing by making this decision? It's a way of sort of catching ourselves to say, are we holding ourselves accountable to what our Indigenous, Black, and racialized stakeholders are asking for? Or are we actually holding ourselves accountable to something else? So that's a little thing that we have now included in our decision-making process. Whose comfort do we prioritize? Porous organizations, they do not avoid opportunities to shift or share power, but they invite them. They actually move towards these things. It's very comfortable for an organization to recruit for diversity. Let's bring people into our organization. Let's hire more diversity. It's very comfortable to have that conversation. It's very uncomfortable to talk about succession planning. How are we going to make sure that the leadership of our organization consistently and predictably represents the racial diversity of the people we serve? That's a much more uncomfortable conversation. But these organizations, they invite that. They are moving towards that. They see this work as critical to their own organizational evolution. Organizations that don't do this work are not going to look very relevant for much longer. They're going to lose their social license to operate. So, they see this as we are not going to be the organization we want to be unless we do this work. It's key to our own organizational evolution. And so thus they're able to move more productively through the difficult feelings that come with change, that snapback, that resistance. The feelings of grief, when your organization is taking changes, like making changes like this, it may mean that you're going to say goodbye to certain partnerships and relationships in the community in order to make space and welcome new ones. That's not easy. It's important to acknowledge the feelings of loss and grief that come with that. But organizations in this porous box, they see it as a sort of muscle. Again, when I mentioned before that muscle in dealing with conflict, it's like a muscle in dealing with loss, metabolizing loss and moving through it, becoming stronger because of it. Moving through what's called clean pain. Resma Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, talks about clean pain. When you know something's wrong and you know what the right thing to do is and you don't want to do it because you're so uncomfortable, but you do it anyway. Regardless of what happens on the other side of that, you've preserved your sense of self-integrity and you're better positioned to do it again, rather than the experience of dirty pain, which I feel like these folks on the left-hand column and really the perpetuating organizations too, they're not responding in a meaningful way to that call to action of the right thing to do. And it's going to lodge that dirty pain in their bodies, in their organizational structures, going to make it harder to change in the future. So these porous organizations, I mean, they're really motivated by the title of the session. Anti-racism and equity is for everyone. They don't see it as a sort of, what's it called? A sort of like total relinquishing and annihilation of self. They see it as a way of inviting in a much more beautiful world for everyone, including themselves. So that is a very different orientation in this work. So we're playing around with these categories and we wanted to get a sense from you all if these resonate. Phil, can you run the poll? Or yes, can everyone see that poll? Take a look at your own organization that you're here representing. Which box most closely aligns with where you think your organization is right now in this moment of cultural revolution that Jax was talking about, that we all feel like we need to respond to in some way. But if you're being honest with yourself, and this is an anonymous poll, where do you feel like you might be? And if you don't see yourself located on this poll, say none of the above. So I'll give you a couple minutes to respond. Jax, anything else you'd add to our new emoji framework?
I think the hardest part about being porous is that continual revisiting of the challenges and developing that muscle. I think often the way we've been trained to understand progress is you do something and it fixes everything. But this is something that I wanted to remind, like, I always think about this when I started doing the work with Thulasy. I used to ask her, how do you keep doing this? And she said that there's, well, you said that it's like kind of like an interpretive dance. It's like you don't actually move forward. It's not a sport like a race, but more like you're building that muscle to constantly respond to invisible forces, because it comes at you in every direction and in every facet of your life. And it's a valuable way of also shifting. I mean, in its self-work, it's changing how I'm learning, how we've been trained to understand what is effective and how things should be. And that's what I wanted to add to that.
Great, thanks so much for your responses here and for being honest, I think, about where you are. I mean, more than half of the group put yourself in those sort of petrified, performative, and perpetuating boxes. Again, I don't think any of those things is meant to be a stick with which to beat yourself with, or us to beat you with. It's just be really honest about the feelings, because I just realized when I was doing all these trainings for organizations, I'm like, okay, this is what you do. These are some things you can do in your hiring process. These are some things you can do, that regardless of what I was putting out there, I was met with some form of resistance. And this was a way for me to describe the various forms of resistance I was encountering. And now in the trainings, trying to name it a bit more clearly, so that you can move through that and move past it, rather sort of being in the air and no one really naming it. So cool, thank you. I think we've got time for maybe like a couple questions about this framework. I've answered a couple in the chat, but does anyone have thoughts? I'm kind of looking at all of these things. Right, someone's saying that you're kind of in the middle of two. This is totally possible. Any other questions? I think we will be able to share this deck afterwards. Erin? Justin? Yes, and we are going to try to, this is the first time we've shown the world this diagram, and we're putting the emoji in just minutes before we started. So we are going to build this into a tool, but we wanted to test it all with you first. So probably a 1 or 2 pager will be coming your way through CommunityWise's social media sometime soon.
Actually, is it okay if I pick one of these questions that's in the Q&A here?
Yeah, go for it.
Judy Sepezi, I hope I probably didn't say that right, sorry, Judy. But the question was, could you comment on whether you believe the systemic racism is fundamentally intentional and planned, or more a result of ignorance or habit, momentum of what exists? I think it's both, actually. But I mean, if an organization ignores reports of racism without being accountable, and what I mean by accountable is not just putting somebody on paid leave, but actually building in transformative justice to understand why was the harm caused in the first place, and is that person who was harmed being taken care of, and what how is the organization changing so that there are measures in place so that those can be avoided. The repetition and perpetuation of those behaviors can be changed and evolve to a space where you can be anti-racist, and that is recognizing where there's fault, and being able to even just recognize that and say, okay, that was racist. I need to learn from that. That is part of the fog. That is part of the matrix that we live in. We are all living in this system that was created by and built on settler colonialism, built on extraction, built on consumerism, on capitalism, and we're expected to succeed in a way that perpetuates all of that. So that is why we can also be complicit to it, because we think that capitalism is good for us. And also, I mean, even understanding that the idea of communism as like having everybody offered the same or an equitable amount of resources is taking away people's motivation to strive. That understanding, I mean, not many people think about that in the dominant culture. It's also it's often considered radical, those radical left people. But now that we live in these COVID times, CERB has become, oh, we need that because I have been affected by it. People who are part of the dominant culture, and using Zoom as a standard way of communicating, which has been offered and created because of the accessibility sector, is now normalized as the way we do things. So we learn from equitable processes by including equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And if we design for the most marginalized, we all gain, because then it's one size fits all. It's not, okay, we have to design for only certain people. If you design for an inclusive and equitable society or organization, then you include everybody. And
Jax,
that's
I'm wondering,
yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No,
I was looking at the time and I want to
okay.
honor everyone's time, but I'm wondering if you could jump to the ladder and circle slide so I can, because it leads off exactly what you're talking about, and then we can end with the video. Yeah, because it really speaks to what you were just talking about, and really what this title of this session is: intersectionality, anti-racism and equity is for everyone. Very quickly, just to describe that right now we're living in a world that likes to structure things in the terms of ladders and sort of in terms of different hierarchies. And today we talked about racial hierarchies, where people at the top of the ladder have a firm foothold. They have really good rungs on the ladder on which for them where they can define and achieve their own goals and move up that ladder in meaningful ways. Whereas people at the bottom of this ladder don't have those structures. Intersectionality is calling to attention that there are no structures for certain groups of people and people living at different intersections to actually move up those ladders. And so intersectionality and equity are looking at this bottom arrow and trying to build those structures so that people can start to begin to survive inside these systems, and start to be able to move up through them and get equal opportunity to very basic things like employment, income, promotion opportunities, like getting a loan, getting a university education, these things that we see as typical markers of success inside of a hierarchical system. But what we want to call attention to is that while we're trying to bring people up the ladder, we also are we need to very importantly think about bringing, how do people at the top of the ladder actually meaningfully make space and come down that ladder? Again, like I said, succession planning is a more material way of actually talking about that come down. But I'm also talking about a sort of psychological coming down, of undoing of a sense of internalized superiority. People at the bottom of the ladder have a sense of internalized inferiority. How can we help people come down without it feeling like, when you're coming down the ladder, it can feel like the G forces of it are sort of strong when you're used to not dealing with conflict, when you're used to not being uncomfortable all the time, like the people at the bottom of the ladder. It can feel like the ladder's flipping when you come down the ladder. But that's not what we're trying to do. Anti-racism is not interested in ladders of any kind, regardless of who's on top. We're interested in creating the circle on the right, which is a world in which everyone is able to show up in the full diversity of themselves, not just some sort of grayscale collapsed identities that are on the left, but moving towards something far more beautiful and diverse on the right, where everyone is supported in the ways that they need to be supported to define and achieve their own goals. Again, the goals in the ladder are all kind of limited at a certain point, whereas we want to actually expand even the goals that people reach for on the circle on the right. And the word decolonization, I mean, I'm not here to define it, except to say that Indigenous worldviews and people and communities and their fights for Indigenous sovereignty can serve as leadership in our movement towards the circle on the right. I use them as leaders. When I think about this framework, even, I was led by people like Leanne Simpson and Eve Tuck and Dr. Michael Yellowbird and Dr. Kim Tallbear, these amazing scholars that are, and activists and leaders and artists that are moving to want us to look towards the long view of this circle. I also look to people in the work of Black liberation. Adrienne Marie Brown was mentioned, Sonia Renee Taylor, Isabel Wilkerson, Ibram X. Kendi, Janaya Khan mentions Asada Shakur's hierarchy and lawyerarchy, really describes the latter as well. And so we have a lot of guides. We have people that have been living at the bottom of the ladder that have a vision for the future that's very different from the one we live in right now. And I think if we can center their experiences and move through all three arrows, that's like the long goal of all of this. And so it is for everyone. It's for making all of our lives a better place and our world a better place. I wanted to get that in before we were done, because it was really speaking directly to what you were talking about, Jax. We have a fun video that we wanted to show to sort of close off the session. that was meant to move us into a place of lightheartedness around all of this. Because again, if you're still feeling the heaviness of the beginning of the session, and maybe the heaviness of this, like maybe this is like
all these protests.
Oh, something that's overwhelming. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and join us next Friday. I guess that's, what time is that happening again, Erin?
You're actually jumping into our announcement, so you can share that. But if you have other kind of wrap up pieces before we move on, I'll still give you some time.
No wrap pieces. I'm good, Jax.
I'm good. Yeah, thanks everybody.
So thank you to both of you for a tremendous amount of information, content, reflection, insight that you imparted on us in a short period of time. So thank you so much just for sharing both your kind of like, I guess, the knowledge-based expertise, but also your lived experiences through all of this. Very much appreciate that. We are, in terms of next steps, we are posting the evaluation link in the chat box if it isn't there already. If you don't get to the evaluation right now, you'll also see a pop-up after this closes in your browser with the evaluation. And you will also be sent it in your email. So if it is not clear by now, we would really like you to fill out the evaluation. Again, it's an opportunity for us to have that information to plan for future events. If you are registered for the Follow-Up Friday event, you will receive an email shortly that will allow you to submit questions for that session. The information's on the screen. That's next Friday, December 11th for an hour, 12 to 1. If you're interested in attending, you can sign up through our event page, and the link is also on the slide there. If you are registered for that, but you can no longer make it, we would appreciate it if you could cancel your order so that we can let other folks in. There's a limited amount of spots for that session. I think that's everything. So just want to thank everyone who attended today for spending this time with us on a Saturday. Thank you again to jaqs and Thulasy, and to the Board Leadership Calgary team for being here and for putting this on. So we will say goodbye for now. Thank you and have a great weekend.